Welcome to the ERLAND LEE Museum home, located in Stoney Creek, Ontario, Canada. This National Historic Site was home to 6 generations of the Lee family and is the birthplace of the first Women's Institute worldwide. Come with me as we take a tour. The first room on our tour is the Pioneer Kitchen. Originally a log cabin built by John Lee for his family in 1808, the original dimensions and floors of this log cabin still remain. This sideboard was constructed by John Lee using wood from the many pine trees found on this property. This is a coal stove from the 1870s, far more modern than the open fire Mary would have used to prepare meals for John and their 11 children. It is easy to complain about modern-day laundry, but women in the 19th century would have to spend hours using this new and improved laundry machine with the mangle built right in. Mary would have done all of the laundry by hand, and this device would have been a great time saver. Every home, no matter the century, has had to deal with rodents one way or another. This humane mousetrap from the late 1800s has a clever mechanism that traps the mouse inside without harming it. This set of plates comes from the estate of Lucy Maud Montgomery, famous Canadian author of Anne of Green Gables and early member of the Women's Institute. The Pioneer Kitchen is representative of the life of an average farm wife in the 19th century. Imagine raising a family of 11 in a space this size. The founding of the Women's Institute, less than 100 years later, would profoundly impact the lives of women just like Mary. It was the youngest son of John and Mary's 11 children, Abram Lee, who brought wealth and prosperity to the Lee family. It is reflected in this formal parlor used only for entertaining and occasions such as weddings and funerals. Abram was a farmer and grew all kinds of crops. He went into business with a young E.D. Smith of Winona and became one of the first commercial growers of Concord grapes. Also a politician, Abram was the reeve of Saltfleet Township and president of Saltfleet and Bimbrook's first fire insurance company. His retirement certificate hangs in the parlor to this day. While hosting guests, you might find Maggie Lee playing a pump organ just like this. As the daughter of an affluent family, she received an education at the Wesleyan Ladies College in Hamilton, which included private music lessons. Guests could also be entertained by this hand-cranked Victrola phonograph manufactured in 1916. By opening and closing the front shutters, one could increase or decrease the volume of the music. Abram and Jemima Lee were proud parents to Marcus, Erland, and Maggie. This tintype features Marcus, his younger sibling Erland, and family friend Eliza Weaver in 1867. It was Abram's strong entrepreneurial and community-minded spirit that would lay the foundation for his son Erland and wife Janet to found the Women's Institute only decades later. The second floor of the ERLAND LEE Museum home tells the intimate and personal story of the next generation, Erland Lee, his wife Janet, and their family. Head upstairs for a look behind closed doors of the Lee family. This area would have been off limits to visitors in a 19th century home. At the top of the stairs, your first sight will be the magnificent view from the second floor landing of the breathtaking Niagara Escarpment. This is what it looks like now. Imagine what it would have looked like over 100 years ago. Step into the master bedroom that belonged to Erland and Janet Lee, who were both educated, affluent, and happily married in 1890. When Erland and Janet were married at the Lee home, Janet brought with her a substantial bridal dowry, including this walnut bedroom suite. Erland, much like his father Abram, was very community-minded. He held the position of township clerk for Saltfleet and was a successful dairy farmer. Erland was also a founding member of the Farmers' Institutes, the educational organization for farmers that facilitated the start of the Women's Institutes. Janet Chisholm Lee came from a wealthy Scottish family and is pictured here with 5 of her sisters in the 1880s. Hamilton's first kindergarten teacher in 1887, Janet excelled at her profession. Unfortunately, society dictated that she retire as a teacher upon her marriage to Erland. A century later, a Stoney Creek school was named in her honor. Erland and Janet raised 5 children in this home, which is quite the contrast to the 11 children Erland's grandmother, Mary Lee, raised in the small room they now used as a kitchen. Flowing off of the master bedroom was the children's nursery, where 3 generations of Lee children would have laughed and played. This baby swing from the early 1900s was very versatile. An infant would bounce in the chair suspended by the springs, and the seat could be removed and used as a rocking chair. Playtime would be structured around gender roles. Girls would play with dolls and tea sets in preparation for the domestic role they would likely play. In contrast, the boys would play with animal figurines and toy soldiers in preparation for a life of farming and/or public service. 19th century cribs often had low railings because babies were tightly swaddled to discourage flailing arms and legs. This whimsical handmade dog served a very important purpose. It would stop drafts from coming under the door of the nursery. To this day, this nursery is still filled with toys reminiscent of days long gone. Erland and Janet raised 3 daughters, Marjorie, Hilda, and Alice. Their room remains today much like it would have appeared in the early 1900s. Marjorie Lee tragically lost her fiancé in the First World War. Afterwards, she never married. Instead, she focused on preserving and sharing her family's history and that of the Women's Institutes. Hilda Lee spent her formative years as a teacher in Hamilton. She later moved to New York to train to become a nurse, then married and settled in Connecticut. Alice Lee took over her father's position as township clerk, becoming the first woman to hold a senior position in Saltfleet Municipal Council. She married and lived in a home not far from her parents. These walnut spool beds would have likely been shared by the Lee sisters in order to keep warm in the winter. The bedspreads come from an American branch of the Lee family. This late 19th century sewing machine was manufactured by the Wanzer Company in downtown Hamilton. Many young women would have learned the domestic art of sewing on a machine just like this. While the Lee women were given tools to be domestic housewives, which is reflected in this room, they were also given the education and opportunity to grow up to be successful in many different ways. The Lee boys, Gordon and Frank, would have shared this room. They spent their days working on the farm and their evenings reading or studying. A shelf of books like this was not an uncommon sight in a young man's room. For an affluent family like the Lees, literacy and education would have been paramount. The eldest Lee son, Gordon, studied at the Ontario Agricultural College, which is now part of Guelph University. He planned on becoming a farmer, as had been the tradition for men in the Lee family. Sadly, the First World War would thwart those goals. Gordon went to France to fight for his country and tragically lost his life near Vimy Ridge in May 1917, just weeks shy of his 23rd birthday. Frank also served his country as a Red Cross ambulance driver. He would ultimately become the last heir, inheriting the family farm and property from his father, Erland. This room is reminiscent of a young man's room during the early 1900s. This desk would have also been shared with the Lee sisters, as Erland and Janet believed in education for young women and men. The dining room of the Erland Lee Museum home is of incredible significance to the Women's Institutes. It was at this very table that Janet Lee hand-penned the Constitution and bylaws of this organization in 1897. This sideboard had been in the Lee family for years, and by happenstance, it was made by Adelaide Hoodless's father-in-law. Who could have ever predicted the connection the Hoodless and Lee families would have in the future? Adelaide Hoodless was the inspiration for the Women's Institutes worldwide. Having suffered the loss of her infant son due to what was perceived as summer complaint from drinking unpasteurized milk, she became a passionate advocate for the education of women in the domestic sciences. Erland Lee invited Adelaide to speak to Stony Creek women at the annual Farmers Institute Ladies' Night about her idea for a Women's Institute. The first meeting was held at Squires Hall on February 19, 1897. 101 women ventured out into the blizzard that evening to show their support. It was at this inaugural meeting that Christina Smith, wife of E.D. Smith, was chosen to become the first president of the Women's Institute. She was intelligent, capable, and held strong traditional views of the role a woman should play in the home. Shortly after the first meeting, several of the charter members, as well as their well-connected husbands, met at the Lee home to compose the Constitution and bylaws of the Women's Institute. This handwritten document remains largely unchanged well over a century later. The primary goal of the Women's Institute is educating women, with a strong focus on community service, and is exemplified by their motto, for home and country. The Women's Institute is officially nonpartisan, but it is still a very powerful lobbying force. It was the first voice for women in Canadian government, having lobbied for health and safety issues pertaining to women, children, and the elderly. An early example of a WI initiative that affects our daily lives is the pasteurization of milk in 1938. Today, the Women's Institute is a global organization with millions of members in over 70 countries. And to think it all had its start in a dining room in Stony Creek. This was once an outbuilding and later the Lee family garage. Now it is the home to the Federated Women's Institutes of Ontario's provincial office. Staff inside are surrounded by the history of the WI as they work to maintain and grow the organization. Take home a memory of your visit to the ERLAND LEE Museum home by visiting the gift shop. Inside, you can find gift items that are handmade by WI members from across the province. Adjacent to the Lee family home is the carriage house, built in 1873. It was used to house buggies, sleighs, and various tools. The original hand-hewn beams remain across the ceiling. Also notice the sleigh well, which contains a cutter sleigh, much like the one Erland and Janet would have used. Erland's sister Maggie aptly called the property Edgemont Farm, and it became the official name of the farm when conducting business. They produced dairy products such as butter and milk. A hand-operated cream separator like this would have been used to speed up the process of separating the cream from the milk. This colorful piece of equipment is a fanning mill that dates back to the 1890s. It would have been used to separate wheat seed from the stalks. The Lees would share theirs with neighboring families to help with their harvest. The museum houses a large collection of historic quilts. A selection of these quilts is on display and changes annually. Quilting is an art form the Women's Institute is known for, and each quilt holds significant historical value. You will also find exhibits on local history, the Lee family, and topics related to the Women's Institutes. There is always something new at the ERLAND LEE Museum home. The ERLAND LEE Museum home is situated on 1.9 acres of land, diligently maintained by staff and volunteers. Located in the backyard is a stone cairn which contains a time capsule from 1997, the centennial year of the Women's Institutes. It is set to be opened in 2047. The ERLAND LEE Museum home is a significant part of Canadian history and a one-of-a-kind location. An integral part of the founding of the Women's Institute, over 2 centuries of Stony Creek history is encapsulated within these walls and throughout the grounds. An educational and entertaining place for friends and family to visit. Make the ERLAND LEE Museum home a part of your next visit to Stony Creek.
Murky.